Hello everyone, this is Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School. And in this video, we are going to make a case, or try to make a case, for the Veresov opening. The Veresov is the first three moves being d4, knight c3, and bishop to g5. Sort of a mirror image Ruy Lopez. The Veresov has never been a very popular opening, although many players have played this. One thing that is really, really excellent about the Veresov opening is the fact that even though there is theory in the position, there are many ways to get out of theory and still have a somewhat exciting position. This type of opening with knight c3 and bishop to g4 could be essentially called a reverse Chigorin defense. For example, if d4, d5, c4, black can play knight c6 themselves with the Chigorin defense, and if white makes a move like knight f3, then black can play bishop to g4, and here we have the same moves as we had with the white pieces, pawn to queen 4, knight to queen, bishop 3, bishop to knight 5. So this type of opening is what I like to call a high contact opening. These moves coming out like this make a lot of contact with the position. And depending on how white plays this position, there will be even more contact, as we will see when we check out the moves. Okay, and this is, say, opposed to other non-bookish openings or openings that are meant to avoid book that do not create such contact. For example, if say someday you decide that you want to start playing the hippopotamus opening, okay, and let's say you started off with b3, okay, and we'll play a few moves here. d5, let's play g3 and bishop g2 and e3, and this is the start of the hippopotamus setup. d3, bishop e6, and I'm just making up moves as I'm going on here. Knight e2, queen d2, h3, a5, a3, and here we have a hippopotamus with white to move. Now, this type of setup with white or black, actually, you can achieve this versus almost any defense, and it is a great way to avoid book if you so choose. I mean, of course, your opponent is in this position is set up rather classically, but I mean, it's very unlikely that your opponent has actually studied this opening so that they know that all of these moves are the most exact, precise moves. Now, so this is great from the point of view of getting your opponent out of book, but as far as contact goes, the only contact that white is really making in the position is on the center pawns here, which are firmly defended. So this means that this is a low contact opening from my point of view. And because of that, the opponent is basically allowed to set up in any way they choose because you are not putting enough pressure on the position to force them to make different, specific moves. And because of that, this is why the Veresov, in my opinion, is one of the better non-book openings that there is, because of all the contact that white makes in the position and the contact that they intend to make later on with a variety of different moves. So this is one of the great parts about it. Now, just to let you know, the computer does not particularly like white in any of the lines. It's not such a tremendous disadvantage. It's just a slight preference for the black pieces in most of the lines. This isn't enough to give up on an opening, however. And like I said, most of your opponents that you will play against will not have a specific system ready for this, unless, of course, you start clobbering them with this a few times, and eventually they might get around to constructing a system against the opening you want, the Veresov here that you're trying to employ. Okay, now I would say that this opening also is good for all time controls, blitz, bullet, rapid chess, classical chess, correspondence chess. This is good at all time controls. I would say also that you could probably get away with this fairly nicely until about maybe the 2150, maybe 2200 level. Once you get up to there, then you'll start playing against players that really do have systems against the Veresov, and you might find it a little tough sledding. But I would say below 2150, this is a really excellent weapon against all types of players. Okay, so now a couple of things about the Veresov that's really nice, and that is the way that you can possibly trick your opponents into other openings. Okay, so for example, one time playing the Veresov after d4, my opponent played d5, and this particular opponent is a very dedicated Queen's Gambit accepted player. So this means if you play the main move c4, he always took. And not too many players that I know of that always play the Queen's Gambit accepted as their main defense to d4. So in order to try to confuse this particular opponent, knight c3 was played. So now that there is no Gambit to accept, already, you know, the person playing black was on their own, essentially. So they make what is a normal looking move, knight to f6. Okay, so this, of course, slows down e4. Then, of course, bishop g5 gets thrown in, and black makes another normal Queen's Gambit accepted type move in the form of e6. A lot of times after you accept the pawn, you have to play e6 anyway in order to be able to develop the dark square bishop. So he's sticking with his plan. However, after the move e4, we have now transposed into a classical French. This was very interesting because this opponent that plays the Queen's Gambit accepted against e4 typically always plays the Najdorf, which is c5, d6, capture, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6. And he always plays this particular defense. So with this particular move order, we have presumably tricked him into a defense that he has never played before. And not only it is not a defense he's not played before, but it's a main line of a defense. So you really have to know what you're doing if you want to, switch to the French defense here. And as it was, the opponent actually did not know what to do and played h6. Now, even Dr. Alyokin has played this particular gambit, but after the very simple bishop takes knight, there really is no good way for black to capture back. If they capture with the g pawn, then simply taking on d5 leaves black with a board full of bad pawns. Well, at least half the board. If they take with the queen, then white again takes on d5, and this wins a pawn for white. Some of you may notice that after pawn takes, knight takes, it looks like that black can play check, but white can just simply either retreat the knight or just simply play queen to e2 and pin the queen to the king. So this is just winning a pawn for black. Another particular opponent who always plays the Albin counter gambit, and we will see some reverse forms of this later on, which is c4, e5. This particular opponent I also played knight c3 against, and e5 is actually playable here, but the opponent did not know that, and again went into this with e6, and again got tricked into the classical French. Now, this opponent, when they have black against e4, always plays the elephant gambit, which is to play d5. So he plays the Albin against queen pawn, elephant against king pawn. Tricking this opponent into a French defense also paid immediate dividends, because after bishop to g5, e6, e4, this person also played h6, and after bishop takes f6, again lost a pawn and got into a bad position. So this Veresov opening can be quite tricky, especially if you choose to transpose back into king pawn games. Okay, so this is one of the general rules with this particular opening, is that after d4, And if your opponent plays a move like, say, knight f6 and knight c3, any move that allows white to transpose back into a king pawn game, that is always the best policy. Although it is certainly possible to play bishop to g5 anyway. But anything that allows e4 on the third move, that is usually the best move for white. This is also true if your opponent plays d5, knight c3, and plays any move that again allows e4. So if they offer a Caro-Kann or offer a French, the best moves here are to play e4, but I will offer a couple different suggestions there. But these are generally the best moves, and these transpose back into e4 games. So for those of you that play e4 naturally on your first move, the Veresov is an excellent way to try to trick your opponent into king pawn games that they might not normally play. So for example, just really briefly here, if you play knight c3 against someone who plays the King's Indian against d4, they would definitely play g6 here, and we could play e4 and d6, and we have transposed to the Peertz defense. But not all King's Indian players are Peertz defense players. You know, for example, I mean, a lot of King's Indian players might be like Bobby Fischer and play the Sicilian Najdorf or the Sicilian Dragon against e4. But against d4 openings, they always play knight f6 and g6 and play more something like a King's Indian defense or a Gruenfeld. But if they do not play the Peertz defense, then the Veresov move order is a really excellent weapon here, because now all of a sudden they have a position that they are not familiar with, hopefully. Okay, so definitely transposing into e4 openings is one of the ideas here. Now, with white, you will play a number of reverse positions. For example, d4, d5, knight c3. If your opponent here plays c5, this is a reverse Chigorin defense. Black has played the Queen's Gambit. We have played the Chigorin defense, but it is also our move. So we get a Chigorin defense with a whole extra move. We could actually transpose into an Albin counter gambit with the reverse moves by playing e4. And here, if black plays pawn takes pawn, we can play the Albin counter gambit move, which is d5. And again, we have a defense with an extra move here. It is black's turn, but we've already achieved knight c3. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, after d4, d5, c4, if black plays this knight c6, this is the Chigorin defense. And in our opening, it would be black to move, but with you know, because we're playing it with white. If they play the Albin, pawn takes pawn, and d4, this is the Albin counter gambit, which is really dangerous. In our opening, we already have knight c6 in. So just imagine if white did nothing in this position and we basically got knight c6 for free, we would have an Albin with an extra move. Now, all of you Albineers out there, or the Albinites or the Albin mongers, or whatever you call yourselves, you might actually enjoy that type of, you know, your favorite opening with an entire extra move thrown in, and a good extra move thrown in on top of that. Okay, now one variation that I am going to make a case for in several different lines is to play a reverse Reefschlager French. Now, if you've never seen the Reefschlager French, it is this variation: e4, e6, d4, d5, French defense. The Reefschlager can only be played against knight c3, generally speaking, and black here can play knight to c6, which is by far not the most popular move in this position. I mean, bishop to b4 is immensely popular, knight f6 is immensely popular, taking is even more popular than knight c6, but knight c6 leads to what is known as the Reefschlager French. Now, this is a much more blocky, solid, I shouldn't say unexciting, because all chess positions can be exciting at some point in the game. But in the beginning here, basically black is going for sort of a a defense where we're not really going to go after the pawns or the pawn chain, depending on what white does here, for a little while. Basically black is going to try to develop their pieces behind the lines a little bit. Now, this particular setup with knight c6 and d5 features two Veresov moves. So in some cases, I am going to make a case for trying to play a Reefschlager setup, but with the white pieces, but with another extra move thrown in. So for example, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop to g5, knight bd7, which is considered the main move in this position. E3 gets a Reefschlager setup with these three moves thrown in, but we have an extra move in the form of bishop to g5. And in the normal Reefschlager, the bishop would be sitting here on c1, trapped behind all the pawns. Here it is out, and we can make use of the solidness of white's pawn center to develop the rest of our pieces without having to suffer some sort of quick attack or an initiative by the black pieces here. So in some cases, this actually comes in, this formation with E3 comes in awfully handy. Okay, now, so first, let us try to build the Veresov one move at a time. I'm not going to go too many moves deep in any line here, but we can start with the very first move, d4. Okay, now, if you want to play the Veresov in an even trickier fashion, you can try to start your games with knight c3. This might even confuse your opponents even more and get them out of their book very quickly. One thing I should warn about that type of thinking, where you want to play moves to get your opponent out of book, the general assumption is that if you get your opponent out of book, that they are going to play worse somehow. They're going to play scared. They're going to make mistakes. They're not going to know what to do. This, of course, is a 50-50 proposition, because sometimes your opponents might actually play better when they have to think for themselves, and they and are tossed out of their book lines right away. So just because you get your opponent out of their book does not necessarily mean they're going to play worse, but there's a very good chance that they could. So knight c3 is a way. So this way, if your opponent plays d5, then again you could play d4 and you're back into Veresov territory. If they play knight f6, you can play d4 and you're again trying to play bishop to g5, and you're again into the territory that we want. Of course, your opponent might make moves like c5, offering a Sicilian, or they might make a move like e5, which does not get into Veresovian territory, but there are some interesting ways to play against this type of thing, because, like, for example, if c5, you possibly could play d4 anyway. And the idea here is that if your opponent takes and we take, and our opponent gets the free move on the queen, we don't necessarily have to play this like a reverse center counter and go queen to a4, although that is probably playable. We also don't have to play queen d1 or queen d3 like we would in a normal center counter defense. But in this position, we could play the more interesting queen to h4. Now, this move doesn't necessarily threaten anything, but it does put the queen on the king's side, bothering a few different squares. Also, it's not quite so easy to harass the queen out here. So we just have our queen out on the king's side. If your opponent happens to castle this way, then we are just sitting outside of their castle, and all it really takes is to bring extra pieces into the attack, and the queen will already be participating in some sort of king side attack. All right, so we could still play interestingly even from the knight c3 move order. Okay, but most of the time, to get this, we play d4 first. All right, now in this position, any slow move, in my opinion, should just be met by e4. So if your opponent plays e6 or d6 or c6 or b6 or g6, any of these moves, then just simply transposing to a king pawn game is perfectly good enough. You have avoided e4, e5, you've avoided the Sicilian, and your opponent has to play something that is a defense that will have less space to it right off the bat. So no problem there. If your opponent plays c5 right away, this is a well-known defense. There is some, interesting ways that we could play. You could definitely play c3 and transpose to a exchange Slav, which is this position, which isn't everybody's cup of tea, but this is certainly playable. You could play e3 and play it like a Kali system or a reverse French, that type of thing. That's certainly possible. The best move is probably d5, just simply gaining space, preventing knight c6, and just trying to hold on to the center, have an advantage in the center for as long as possible. This transposes to many Benoni type positions. If you want to play a Gambit, there is also the transposing into a Smith-Mora, where you could play e4, and this is the Smith-Mora Gambit to the Sicilian defense, e4, c5, d4. And if black takes, then of course you can play c3 and go into a Smith-Mora Gambit. You could play knight f3 first and then c3, whatever your taste happens to be. Now, the only two other moves on move one that cause some problems. One is e5. Now, of course, this is the England Gambit. Here, I would recommend accepting the Gambit, just simply capturing. And depending on how your opponent plays, there's basically two main ways here. One is to play knight c6 and try to get the pawn back. I recommend knight f3, queen to e7. Now, this one is intending to not only try to pick up the pawn again, but have some tactics based on queen to b4 check. So, for example, if you play bishop to f4, queen to b4 check, and there is some tactical problems here. And there's a variety of different ways to play. In my opinion, by far the most simplest move is to go back into Veresov territory and just play knight c3. This not only develops a piece, it not only threatens to invade with knight to d5, but it makes sure that queen b4 is no longer check, which is a major consideration. This does give our pawn back, however, and then with the very simple e4 move, in my opinion, white already has a very stable advantage here. We have a Scotch opening where black has played queen to e7 very, very early, which clogs up the development, and white can just develop and have a nice space advantage right off the bat, and black will have a hard time reorganizing their pieces. In my opinion, white is clearly better here. The only other way that has been of interest of late is bishop to c5. And the idea here in a couple of moves is to play d6 followed by knight to e7. For those of you that watch YouTube videos, you've probably seen a few of these where they play, something like this, like knight f3, d6, pawn takes pawn, oh no, my knight. And then when they capture the knight on e7, black captures on f2, and this wins for black because after king takes bishop, the queen is hanging. This is exactly the same as the Tennyson Gambit. E4, d5, knight f3, takes, knight to g5, knight f6, guarding the pawn. And here's somewhere along the line, somebody invented the d3 Gambit. And after pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, or bishop takes pawn on d3, white is suddenly threatening knight takes f7. So if black gets sloppy here and does something like, h6, then white will sacrifice the knight. And again, we have the exact same England Gambit trap in reverse. King takes bishop, or king takes knight, bishop g6 check, and this wins the queen. Exact same trap. Okay, so going back to this one, it is well known in this position that the best way to handle this is to simply play knight to c6, which again, not only develops a piece, and it also not only blocks up this diagonal, it also protects the queen. So this way, if they try to go for this particular trap now, it's not really going to be useful when the knight is guarding the queen. So white will end up just two pieces in arrears there. Okay, so my suggestion against the England is to capture, and if they play bishop to c5, that we could, again, stick with our Veresov guns and still play knight to c3. And here we have the exact same thing in reverse, where we are actually protecting our queen. So after take and take, if black wants to go in for knight to e7, then this again just wins mucho material because the queen is protected. So bishop takes f2 isn't on. And so therefore, more likely you would get something like knight c6, knight f3, and maybe black will offer some sort of gambit or something like this. But this position is already extremely good for white, very solid. And all white has to do is develop the rest of the pieces. There's no more tactical tricks for black, and black is down a pawn for a long time. So that leaves f5, which is kind of outside the scope of this particular video. Some people might actually like playing knight c3 in this position. One particular line, black, in order to stop white from playing e4, is to play d5, which is as if we have d4, d5, knight c3, and black just went f5 here. Some people might actually like this position with white because of the open square on e5. You could put the bishop on f4. You can put the knight on f3 and have a flood of pieces going into e5. Some people will like this position with black because it will be harder for white to achieve the e4 advance. So black will have a nice grip on the light squares. So, but this is a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about here. I personally don't believe that knight c3 is the best move for white against the Dutch, but we'll leave that for another video. Okay, so the two moves that we are most concerned about is knight f6 and d5. Both of these moves slow down e4. Not necessarily prevented. I mean, of course, there's many players here that will play e4 and go into the Black-Mardemer Gambit. Okay, however, we're intending knight c3. And so with this, we'll look at some of the other moves other than knight f6, which is considered the main line, because that, again, slows down e4 the most. So, for example, and in fact, I should mention here that if black wants to, black can actually transpose to a French defense or a Caro-Kann defense just by simply playing c6 or e6. And in my opinion, there is really nothing better than to play e4 and go into a king pawn game. Now, from my point of view, however, in my opinion, I should say, this particular way of playing against the Caro-Kann, in my opinion, there are two better ways to play against the Caro-Kann. One is to play the two knights variation, which looks like this, which I think is a good line for white, and also just the very simple d4, d5, e5, the advanced variation. Both of these lines are very good for white. So for those of you that like to play the Caro-Kann, if you happen to get this position with the black pieces, you can go into your favorite Caro-Kann variation and not have to face the most terrifying lines. Now, and the reason why I say all of this is because in this position, I think that if black plays just simply bishop to f5, black has got really good chances to equalize in these variations. For those of you that like to play knight to f6, these are also fairly interesting, but I think white keeps the edge most of the time. But bishop f5 is the one that I'm the most concerned about. I don't think there's any real way to just completely run over that move with the white pieces. Okay, but if you're a type of player that does not like bookish positions, here I would recommend the move bishop to f4, which transposes into what is known as the Jobava London. I've always called this the lesser Veresov because in the Veresov, we put the bishop on g5. So whatever you call this, transposing to this is another playable way against those that are playing c6. And here, of course, the idea is, play e3, knight f3, bishop d3, castle, and just have a solid position with, and not a very bookish position. So it's, not a lot of traps, and you could just basically achieve a fine, a playable middle game. Let's just say that. Okay, so, and it's the same thing with e6. There is nothing better than one e4 transposing back to the French. If you don't want to play mainline openings, again, playing bishop f4 is perfectly playable, albeit black will have better chances to equalize against this opening. But again, you're dragging your opponent into some obscure territory. Notice that e6 is one of the only moves that prevents bishop to g5 achieving a Veresov. So this is always something to consider. Okay, now on move 2 here, there is some other interesting ways to play. One of them is to play a reverse London with bishop to f5. Now, in any line where the bishop goes to f5, I think that f3 is an excellent idea. We have the ideas of playing e4 and expanding in the center. In some cases, we have the idea of expanding on the king side with g4 and h4 and going for an early pawn storm. We also can play e3 and just simply use our pawns to guard all the squares on the center and king side, and then go for a bishop to d3 development. I think that f3 is a perfectly fine way to play with against bishop to f5. If the opponent plays c5 and goes directly into the Chigorin defense in reverse, I think that going into an Albin in reverse, it has a lot of potential here and a lot of fun attached to it. So the idea is that if pawn takes pawn, we play d5, and we have, all the Albin ideas here, bishop out, queen up, castling long, maybe possibly f3 to just really open the position. I think this has got a lot of potential to it. It is interesting to note that c5 is by far not the most popular move in this position, and that's probably one of the reasons why. e5 is a gambit that I've played myself and played against, and I think this actually has some more respectability to it. The idea here is that if we accept the pawn, black plays d4, and when the knight moves to e4, black has queen to d5, which leads to a fairly interesting position. Perhaps white is a slightly better here in this type of thing. Black will get the pawn back, but we'll have to waste some time moving the queen around. But this leads to some extremely interesting adventures. If you do not want interesting adventures, then this might be one of the times that we can use the Reefschlager maneuver by playing e3. Now, this, of course, does trap in our bishop, but we are playing a Reefschlager defense in reverse, although we have not encouraged knight to c6. But here, I think that white has a fairly solid position and is not really attackable here. So you can set up your pieces in any way. One particular way that I think is interesting is to eventually affect b3 and bishop to b2 with knight ge2, which makes everything defended. This will allow you to lift up your queen and possibly castle queenside with some interesting play. If we can encourage the pawn to come to e4, we have some interesting play based on f3. So this is again a way to get a playable position that undoubtedly your opponent has not really studied beforehand. Okay, so now, okay, so let's go move on here. So another second move alternative is knight c6. So this is basically just playing copycat chess here. This one, I think that we also could play the lesser Veresov with bishop to f4. And in this case, because the knight has already committed itself, we are already threatening knight to b5 with a like a mirror image fried liver attack on c7, which could be quite good. So this isn't one interesting way to play. I also think e4 is a good move here. Again, going into somewhat Alban counter Gambit territory. However, here, of course, black could transpose back into the defense that I said was actually quite interesting for black. So perhaps this is one of the future of the position, is to play like a double Veresov and go into a Reefschlager here. So I think this could lead to some fairly interesting chess. Okay, so that leaves, like I said, anything small here should allow e4. So for example, if they play a move like g6, then just simply playing e4 ought to give white, an opening advantage, maybe a small opening advantage, but white will have more space and more opportunities there. So we don't really have to worry about anything small like that. All right, which leaves the final move. Although, wait a minute, let's back up here. D4. Okay, let's go back to knight f6 here, because this is also an interesting move order. This we can go through very quickly. Now, because knight f6 was played on this move, we could also play a Veresov by playing the bishop g5 move first, which might even lead to more adventures. We could also transpose back into the Veresov with d5, knight c3. So we even have bishop g5 as a possibility. But if you play knight to c3, this definitely threatens e4. So any move other than d5 is best met by e4. So if they try to play a King's Indian, we just immediately force them to play the Pirt's defense. And then they have to play d6. And then here you can play, if you want to play bishop g5 and stick to Veresov territory, that's perfectly okay. If you want to play your favorite line against the Pirt's, whether that be f4 or f3 or bishop e3 or knight f3 or whatever, or bishop to e2 or whatever that is, you can now play that particular line against this move order. If your opponent plays d6, then again we could play e4. And now here your opponent might play a Philidor with knight bd7 and e5. They might play a Pribble defense with c6 and queen a5, or they could play g6, but I still think that this is white's best way against all of these moves. Interestingly enough, if you play the Veresov against this particular move order, you are actually walking into a line that Garry Kasparov used to play when he was younger against the Trompowsky, which is to play d4, knight f6, bishop to g5, d6. And the idea is to play knight bd7 and make sure that this knight is held by the knight, so that any capture by the bishop is going to be met by a capture by the knight. So in my opinion, if because of that, if you play d6 and go in for bishop g5 now, knight bd7 might actually be a really good move for black. So this is why it's good to just simply transpose back into king pawn games with knight to c3. Okay. So this we would regard as the main position of the Veresov opening. And here is where where black has played two very logical moves, slowing down any e4 advance. And we have to have a strategy against any possible third move that black could throw at us here. Now, some ideas that white could play with, and in fact, that's one of the other great things about the Veresov, is that you have multiple options in almost every position. So if you try out one move in a position and you get crushed in 15 moves, you have other options that you can try later on until you find something that works for you. Okay, so different strategies for white right off the bat. Number one are versions of the Veresov where you capture on f6 and black has to take back with a pawn, either the g pawn or the e pawn. These are, this type of strategy you can use if you're a type of player that plays, say, the Ruy Lopez exchange variations, like so. And positions where you like to give up the bishop for the knight and then play against the weak pawn structure that your opponent has. If you're a type of player that likes the Nimzo Indian defense and at some point likes to take on c3 and damage white's pawns, then and play against the pawns, then this type of strategy might be for you. For those of you that like to play the Rosso Limo Sicilian, so any Sicilian that involves bishop to b5 very early, and then like to play these lines where you capture on c6 and again play against the weak pawns, then this type of strategy will be for you, where you can capture. Okay, so a second strategy that can be used in these kind of positions are ones that involve f3. These are very aggressive because, of course, they are intending to play a very quick e4 and possibly play e5 and start to push the knight around. It also sets up the g4, h4 pawn roller with the pawn on f3. So there's various ways that you can get a kingside pawn roller. And of course, coupled with that is the idea of lifting up the queen to d2 or d3 and castling queenside. So that way your king will be well protected on the queen side, and you could just start hurdling pawns all up the board here. So this is a very aggressive way to play the Veresov. There is a solid way to play the Veresov, and that is versions with e3 once again, just simply guarding the d4 pawn, letting the light square bishop out, just planning, ultra simple development, bishop d3, knight f3, or knight e2, something like this, and castling short. Just playing a solid position, but one that, again, is presumably not in your opponent's repertoire, not in their book. So you're getting positions where, both sides will have to think for themselves. Okay, now there are other strategies, like, for example, lifting up the queen very early and then going for a quick queenside castle, or lifting up the queen to d3 and going for a quick e4, attacking the center and also coupling this with castling. So this is one that a lot of grandmasters that play the Veresov, they like this particular strategy. So this is one that you can consider. There are strategies where we might play e4 as a pawn sacrifice, leading to either a reverse Albin or a Black Mardimer Gambit, or what is known as the Hubsch Gambit, where you can actually just sacrifice the pawn and utilize the open position to develop your pieces really quickly. There will be times when it will be possible to play e3 and f4, playing it kind of like a reverse Stonewall, where we don't have the pawn on c3, but we've got a knight on c3, but we also don't have the bishop blocked in on c1. We have the bishop out here on g5. So something like a hyper accelerated Stonewall attack, which is another strategy. There are also some obscure strategies, which we might actually show a couple of these. One of them, which a few of my students have liked, are like early A3s, which I guess keeps a bishop off of b4 and perhaps will defend the queen's side a little bit better. Another one is to play f3, but with the idea of bringing the bishop back to f2. From h4, so f3, bishop h4, and f2, and then eventually like lifting the queen, castling queenside, and playing e4, something like that, where it's a lot more obscure. And in the main position, which is knight bd7, we'll look at this one last, actually. There is a couple more obscure moves that even I've played in this position, one of them being g3, just going for some sort of strange Catalan type position, but without c4, something like that. And then in this position, I have also played g4 here before, which is probably not a good move. But one of the ideas is that if black actually takes the pawn, then we can take on d5. So, and have something of a strange position right off the bat, where, both sides have to think for themselves. So not only do we have some regular strategies. You know, E3 is more solid. Lifting up the queen is more solid. F3 is aggressive, but we also have somewhat obscure moves that we can play from time to time. Okay, so now in this position, there are basically 10 little moves here that we can play with black, and I will show a way to play against each of them. Quite simply, let's just start with E6, because this is probably the most common move in this position, especially with people that have never had this position before. They will just simply play E6, and maybe they're thinking that they'll just go into some sort of Queen's Gambit decline type of setup, or a Tarrasch defense with C5, something like that. Now, if you want to play in non-bookish territory, I can recommend the move E3. Just simply planning knight f3, bishop d3. Also, with the pawn on e6, this also gives rise to pawn f4. So, for example, if black plays in reverse Colley system, we can play pawn to f4 and slow down the e5 push for a long time, and then play it like a Dutch stone wall, but with our bishop on the outside of the pawn chain. So this is one way to play in non-bookish position. In my opinion, however, e4 is the best move. This will require you to know something about the classical French, but this does give white a good position. So that's how we would deal with e6. Okay, another move is knight to e4. This, in my opinion, is one of the weaker moves, even though now it's black that's making all the contact with the position. This contact can be diffused very easily just by simply capturing. And when black captures, we play once again the move e3. This will help develop our bishop. If we can play bishop to c4, that would be a very good diagonal for the bishop, and we could play knight to e2 and castle afterwards. Now, the one thing to know about this position is that most of your opponents, and when you get this far, will notice this move c6, which actually does have a nice little trap involved with it, which is, of course, playing queen a5 check, winning the bishop on g5. So in this position, this will require some memory that the best move here is to play queen to d2. Black also is threatening queen b6, which will unpleasantly attack the b pawn and force some sort of concession in order to defend, like b3. However, queen d2 solves all of these problems, and in my opinion, white already has a small edge here. Queen a5 has been seriously reduced. Queen b6 is no longer a real problem when you can just simply castle and guard the pawn like this, and white already has excellent development and really good chances here, in my opinion. So this, in my opinion, is just a very simple way to deal with knight to e4, which is not black's best move. Okay. All right, so now let's go for c5. c5 is basically trying to transpose to a Queen's Gambit in reverse. So here we have, once again, a Chigorin defense where we actually have a reverse Chigorin, but is actually white to move here. Normally, if it were black playing, black would actually have just played bishop to g4, and then it would be white's turn. But since we're playing it with the white pieces in reverse, we actually get all of these moves and the turn. So this must be really excellent. So I would recommend playing e4 here. Now, actually, as a pawn sacrifice. So here's one of these ones where we're going to try to go into a reverse Albin, and after capture, then it turns out here that white actually has 3 interesting moves. So like I said, if one of these moves does not work and you end up getting slaughtered for some reason, there are 3 moves you can try until you find one that suits what you want. I've always played d5 in this position, and this is a direct transposition to an Albin counter gambit where we already have an extra move in the form of bishop to g5. So to show you what I'm talking about here, in the Albin, we would have this setup: pawn takes pawn, d4, preventing knight c3, knight to f3. black played knight c6 to guard the pawn. And in our opening, we would have played this and this, which is a really good move for black. And a lot of times black's next move is either bishop to e6 to attack the pawn, or to play bishop f5 to bother the c2 square, or to play bishop to g4 to bother the knight. We just happen to choose the one that bothers the knight. And so c5, e4 here. So we didn't choose this or this, we chose this one, but we get this position with a whole extra move. Two other interesting possibilities. One of them is to capture. And this is basically leading to something like a Queen's Gambit accepted of some type, where white actually has really interesting chances here. Also, this pawn isn't, that firmly defended. Bishop to b5 check, or possible queen trades are on, and lots of interesting play could happen here. The third interesting move is to give the immediate bishop to b5 check, which is also very Albanish, and can lead to some interesting play. So all three of those moves, just simply capturing, pushing, or bishop to b5, all very playable after this, after the Queen's Gambit move. Okay, so let's move on here. Let's see. Okay, let's go knight c6 in this position. So this is something that probably like a youngster would play, or a beginner, somebody that never had this position before, but is following the rules of development. Let's develop pieces. Let's control the center. So this is a type of move that you would see from somebody trying to obey those rules. However, in this particular case, this knight actually does stop a lot of black's counterplay already, because there's no more c6, no more c5, and all of that. And here, I would say that, probably any of the moves are good. You could probably play f3. You could probably lift the queen. You could probably play, you might even play an e4 style gambit. I would just recommend, again, going for the Reefschlager setup, because now, again, if black plays e5, then we are directly transposing to a Reefschlager setup where white has got a serious extra move in the form of the pin on the knight. So this means if they transpose directly into the French here, because of all the high contact, we've got contact here, contact here, contact here. We're going to have contact on d5. This already can't be good for black when white can just simply capture. And now there's a double attack here. There's a pin here. And so transposing to a king pawn game is immediately losing for black here. So I would say e3 is a fairly good move. And even if black does not play e5 in this position, again, you just have very simple development with knight f3, bishop here or bishop here, castling short with a perfectly playable game. All right, now here we'll get to one of the more popular moves in this position, which is bishop to f5. Now, bishop f5 directly leads to a reverse London. These are all London style moves. And so basically we're playing the Chigorin defense against the London opening. Because there's a bishop on f5, in these cases, I definitely like f3. This is trying to pick on the fact that the bishop has been developed here very early and intending to make it into a target, either with e4, either with g4, whatever. One thing I will say about f3 is that it does lead to a couple of trappy situations, which are not good for black. One of them is e6, which I've given as a double question mark. This is a double question mark because it actually loses instantly to e4. And no matter how black plays this, they're going to lose a piece. There are some tricky details here, though, that we should probably examine. So whether black takes or not, it really does not matter. It leads to basically the same thing. But let's just show it. So if black does not take and just backs off, then here this is pinned to the queen. So we should pig pile on him. And if they just give up the knight, then they're down a piece. The only detail that you must know here is what happens if black kicks. We should not actually exchange bishop for knight because that actually doesn't do much. What we should do is just simply back off on h4. The pin remains, the pig pile remains, and black cannot block it out with g5. So this means white wins a piece, and therefore white is winning. So that's pretty simple. If black takes first, then there's a couple of details. One of them is that if bishop to g6, then again, we do the same thing, and this wins a piece. Very simple. So the only other detail is bishop to g4. And here, like the queen is being attacked, but the queen is attacking the bishop. The knight is defending the bishop, but is also being attacked by the dark bishop, which is being, it's also being pinned to the queen. So there's lots going on here. But very simply, if white just simply captures the knight on f6, then white ends up a piece ahead. If black captures on f6, then we can capture on g4, and there's our extra piece. Of course, here black can win the pawn, but that's going to open the d file, and that's just losing for black. On bishop takes knight, if black says, "Yay, I won the queen," white also wins the queen, and so if black chooses to save the bishop, we could save our bishop. If they choose to take our bishop, we choose to take their bishop, and we end up a piece ahead. We've got 3, they've got 2. If they just simply try to escape with moving the bishop, we escape by taking. And again, white has 4 pieces and black has 3. So all these are completely winning for white. So that's one trick. Another tricky position is knight to c6. This, I believe, should also be met by e4. And we have a high contact position. Once again, everything's under attack. So this is what I'm talking about earlier, when you have a sort of non-bookish position or something that your opponent's not used to, but you're making contact with various parts of their position. That is much easier to score a win against than an opening where you're making no contact with them at all. It's very hard to get, tactical situations. Here, if black captures, I recommend this one, which I actually call the flurry variation. I played this a few times in the late 90s and early 2000s. One of the ideas here is that on knight to e5, we can actually play pawn takes pawn, which is what was a recommendation of my wife back in 1999, and here it is over 20 years later, and even Stockfish likes this particular move. The idea is with after knight takes e4, we can play queen to d4, and you could check this out for yourself. I've actually played a few games with this one, all just basically getting a free win every time. All these pieces here are in a jumble, and white has various tactical moves that they can play that does pretty severe damage. So these are a couple examples of the power of f3 against bishop to f5. Okay, so the best move here, in my opinion, is c6. Now, this is one of these moves that if black times this move correctly, this is probably one of the ways that black could actually slow down the Veresov somewhat, because of the fact that not only is the d5 pawn firmly held, but the queen has 2 really nice squares to go to, depending on how the opponent plays. And these moves will give black some counterplay, since the queen won't have to sit here and babysit the d5 pawn anymore. Okay, so with the bishop on f5 and the pawn on c6, I would recommend the move e3, not necessarily e4 in this position. There is really nothing to gambit against. But the idea here is that we're keeping control of the center. And if black chooses to play a move like queen to b6, there is this kind of nice gambit that white can play involving bishop to d3, trying to attack the bishop. And when black accepts the gambit, we can just simply play knight ge2. And, with the idea of rook to b1, and, castling, this type of thing. And white already has really good development, is making lots of contact with black's position, and has lots of opportunities to expand all over the board. I think white's got a lot of compensation for this pawn in this type of position. If you don't like to gambit that early, or to play obscure gambits after queen to b6, you can also play an idea that I used to play a lot in the late 90s, which is whenever the queen comes out to b6 to attack b2, we just simply play rook to b1. Now, we would love to not have to play rook to b1. This is not the greatest square for the rook, but this has some futuristic ideas of basically developing a few pieces, castling short, like bishop, bishop, something like this, like bishop here. Let's see, like this, play knight e2. Let's just give some normal moves, castle, bishop to e7. And then the idea here is that we have also, kind of, again, a very non-bookish position where we have lots of options and lots of things that we can play for. One thing that I kind of like to do in these kind of positions is to somehow move the c3 knight and eventually play c4 with something like a delayed queen's gambit, which sounds really ridiculous because after d4, d5, you could play the queen's gambit and it's considered one of white's best moves, and you could do it on move 2. Why would you delay it and play it on move 11 or move 12? Nevertheless, this idea did bear fruit and did win a few games. So I mean, it's not completely terrible, and very hard for the opponent to figure out what all is going on here. Okay, c6 after bishop to f5. Okay, so let's back up to here. So that's the bishop f5 adventures. Okay, so let us look at c6 immediately. Okay, so c6 immediately is going to, again, bring the queen to b6 or a5 and with some, some pressure. Again, in this position, I would recommend ye olde e3. Again, just solidifying the queen pawn. If queen to b6, then again, we have some interesting gambit play with the form of bishop to d3, queen takes b2, knight ge2, guarding the knight. Here again, rook to b1, castling. Another good move in this type of position is f4 and f5, meeting whatever pawn decides to show up to help develop the dark square bishop. We can castle and play f4, f5. This is also a very interesting gambit. If you don't like interesting gambits, then again, you could try out my move, which is rook to b1. And again, going for knight, maybe something a little more queen's gambit-y, where the knight actually goes to f3 instead of pawn to f3. So say something like, oh, I don't know, like how about this? Bishop d3, bishop g6, knight f3, knight bd7, castle, and e6. Here again, you can use the idea of trying to play a delayed c4 by just simply moving the knight, something like this, and then trying to play c4 and just go into a queen's gambit, but later on down the game. You never know. This type of thing might weird your opponent out. Anyway, so c6 is a reasonable move, but we can just simply play e3, or with the gambit ideas, or with rook to b1. Okay, so now we're getting into down to the end here. Let's see, a6. Let's take a look at a6. This is I think the Stockfish recommendation. This is probably playable, but again, I think just simply playing e3 and playing it with bishop to d3, knight f3, castles, that type of thing, white should have a fairly playable position with with good chances. Because this is such a slow move, I would assume that you could also play f3, or you could play possibly an e4 gambit with f3, because black is flicked in a6. Those are all very playable as well. H6, this was even seen in the Spassky-Korchnoi match of 1977. Here, I believe that white actually has two interesting ways. One is just to simply take, the other is just to simply back up, both leading to various adventures. Bishop to H4 should also lead to, like an E3 follow up with knight F3, bishop to D3, and so on, with very solid play. Capturing here leads, okay, so any variation that leads to this should be met with E3. It looks like that we could play E4, but the problem with E4 in these kind of positions is that when black opens up the center, black has got two bishops, but white's got two knights. So I'm not certain if anybody out there wants to actually open the position for your opponent's bishops. In my opinion, this is a very faulty strategy. The correct thing to do here is to play E3 and then basically go for a setup that looks something like C6, bishop D3, bishop D6. And here we change up a little bit and play queen F3 with knight GE2 and H3 with a very solid position on the king side and center. We have a very flexible king where we could actually castle short or long. And we have some doubled pawns to play against, and these pawns are somewhat stunted, so they could easily be attacked. Also, the G7 pawn is not defended, so we might try to make a plan trying to deal with that. Okay, so that covers A6 and H6. Okay, so two last moves. One of them is G6. Basically, black is playing in Grunfeld style with G6 and D5. Okay, now against this, there's probably quite a few moves that are okay here. Some people might not mind capturing here, like this, and again, weakening the pawns and playing E3 and just playing against the doubled pawns. The F3 is certainly playable here, I would say, with the idea of expanding with E4. I would say that Queen D2 probably has the best chances here. Again, with Queen D2, we're trying to perhaps go after the dark square bishop after it plays to bishop to G7 or possibly before. We have the option of castling queenside very quickly. We also have the option of playing F3 and then going for some sort of kingside pawn roller. This, I think, gives white the most amount of chances against G6, which leads to the absolute main move, which is knight BD7. Now, the idea with this move is that since the knight is now covered, any variation that features bishop takes F6 must be faulty for white. This is not going to damage any pawns, and it's just going to give up the bishop pair for very little cost. So that's one of the points to this. The other point is that black now, both the C and E pawns are flexible, so there might be a chance to play E5, might be a chance to play C5, C6 and E6 are all possibilities. So white will have to pay attention to the various options there. Now, one thing I would say about knight BD7 that is not in black's favor is that it clogs his position somewhat, clogs up the queen, clogs up the light B. And so we should try probably at least to try to keep black bottled up as long as possible and not let him expand in the center of the board. Okay, so here again, I would recommend the move E3. This position actually has been featured in a couple of different articles. One was from Grandmaster Dorian Rogozenko, who wrote an article for the SOS series in volume 2, where he was making a case for queen to D3. I saw a YouTube video with International Master Ratkovich, who was very excited about the move F3. So first of all, I wanted to show a couple of things about both of those moves. Queen to D3 has the idea of playing for a very quick E4 and a very quick castles. So a very centralized and coordinated development. Like I said, many grandmasters seem to like this move, queen to d3. So if you want to follow the GMs, this move is for you. I do want to point out here, however, that after the move c6, which again is a very solid move, which again lets the queen come out to a couple of squares while at the same time holding on to the pawn. The move that was recommended was e4. However, after capture, 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 which was all forced, the move that was displayed in the Rogozenko article was the move queen to a5, which makes a check and it attacks the bishop, but it allows the bishop to back up to d2. The move that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is the move queen b6. This is the other move that c6 allows for. And queen b6 unpleasantly attacks the b2 pawn. And there really is no favorable way to defend this pawn. Moving the pawn to b3 just weakens all the dark squares. So this is not very nice. The most bishop c1, of course. I mean, why would we play bishop g5 and then bishop c1? No one wants to play chess like that. And the most natural way to guard it actually runs into a tactic here, which is to play queen a5 now. And suddenly we got a fork here on a2 and g5. And this, in my opinion, already gives black the upper hand. One game from a long time ago went d5, knight b6, good move, like ganging up on this d5 pawn terribly, still maintaining the attack here. And after capture, capture, pawn f4 to guard the check. So white actually gives away the bishop with check just to play f4, but is trying to land c takes b, which is going to win the piece back. However, in this position, black actually has a brilliant move in the form of queen g6. This is offering a queen trade. It is also attacking the c6 pawn. So this way, you know, if we could take the pawn and just diffuse the attack, black will emerge a piece ahead here. The other technical point is that if white actually captures the queen, then black should actually take with the f pawn here, even though it looks like this one, taking with the h pawn, helps out the rook. Taking with the f pawn actually gives black a square. And the reason why this is important is because if you took with the h pawn here, white actually has pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, bishop b5, checkmate. Well, okay, he can go here, but this is checkmate. Well, okay, it's not checkmate, but it's losing tons of material here. You know, it's basically like the same as getting mated. So this means that the technical detail here is f takes, so that after c takes b, bishop takes b7, bishop to b5 check, we now can play king f7 and emerge material ahead. Now the king is kind of drafty and so forth, but this should be a fairly a clear advantage for black. Okay, so yeah, these queen d3s are somewhat hard to trust, in my opinion, although maybe someone could do some homework and figure out a better way with queen to d3. One of the other good things about queen d3 is that you can use the third rank in some cases in addition to supporting e4. f3, you know, back in the late 90s, there was a computer program. It was the Chess Master series, the International Master Josh Waitzkin computer program, the Chess Master 9,000, 10,000, whatever it was. And I would often play f3 against that particular machine. And the one variation that it kept playing against me that I thought was extremely irritating was that it would kick me first, back up, and actually it played two moves here. One of them is e6, which I believe even Wesley So has played in this position. So this is probably not that bad if even Grandmaster So is playing it. But the move that was most irritating was to now play c5. And this, I don't know, this is very, very risky at best, in my opinion, for the white pieces. And I think black has actually probably got a really good position here. And I've never trusted it. So this is why in these kind of positions, I would make a case for just to simply play e3. This Black is not going to uncramp himself anytime soon by moving this knight. So if we just play solid in response and just simply try to go for one of the various plans of bishop d3 and knight f3, or maybe f4 and knight f3 and bishop d3, and also if Black tries to throw in queen to b6, we could try to play an interesting gambit or play rook to b1 with a solid game. And I don't think that, this position might be equal. Maybe the computer just judges it to be a touch better for Black, but I don't think White is without prospects here, and has excellent chances to get a perfectly playable game out of all that. Okay, so I think that covers everything. So we'll just end it with that. So thank you guys for going with me on this small Veresovian adventure. As usual, I am National Master Bleorg at Lichess, BLEEORG. If you want to message me with your games in the Veresov, I would be happy to make a video containing viewers' games so we can examine how this can be played from all different points of view. At any rate, this has been Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School, and this has been Making a Case for the Veresov opening, and I shall see you guys on the next one.